So as we've seen with Houdini 19, there are a couple of new ways of using Vellum to calculate other things than, regular soft bodies like cloth or strings or something like that. You can even calculate fluids, as we will see in the next video, grain, as we've seen, even though I would not recommend it for classical grain. And the new thing is rigid bodies. Now, this was kind of already possible to create rigid geometry by just lowering the resolution and maybe using something like a strut constraint or something like that. But now Side Effects added a new constraint called shape match constraint. And if you type in shape or shape match or anything like that, you will not find it for some reason. I'm not completely sure why. Also, Vellum rigid or something is also not working. So to my knowledge, you have to create it yourself with a fresh Vellum constraint, and then you will find shape match because it's the latest that was added right at the bottom. And even with multiple objects like here, it will now try to create a constraint that forces these objects into their original shape, which is basically the definition of a rigid object. It cannot change its shape. So when we put this into a Vellum solver and activate the ground plane, of course, and let this run. And for some reason, my normals are always broken when I do this. So let's add a normal node. There you go. Looks a bit nicer. And if I run this, then you can see the objects actually behave as if they are rigid. Now, of course, this is not a replacement for a real rigid simulator like the RBD bullet solver that we will see in the next chapter. But of course, as we've seen, it can be helpful if you want to combine rigid object with soft objects, because that, weirdly enough, is still a problem in Houdini. So here you go. That's really all you need to know. For all the rigid objects, you create the shape match constraint. Now, like I said, it was kind of possible to do something like this before, for example, with a struts constraint. And there are other options even to create a really stiff constraint. So the struts here, you can make sure that the stiffness is very high, and then you will get a very similar result. So as you can see here, but it's not completely stiff because you might have to increase the substeps. And this is actually where the new shape match is better. My point is, it was not completely impossible before. It was just very calculation heavy to do something like that. And you can see here, of course, with the 3 substeps, a shape match didn't need that. So of course that is faster. But I actually created a comparison here between a strut setup and a shape match that both used the same substep number. And at least I tried to give it very similar results. And the difference by my calculation is, for a couple of frames at least, the struts took 21 seconds to calculate and the shape match for the same range 14 seconds. So it's a lot faster actually to use shape match, and that alone is a reason to use it, even though it's not that it was completely impossible to do before. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind though. First of all, the whole thing tends to be a bit bouncy, and you might have seen this already. So if you really need something rigid like a wood or something, then you wouldn't want this to be as bouncy as it is here. But this is kind of the nature of Vellum, and to my knowledge there is not much you can do about this, unfortunately, because basically the system tries to recreate its shape, and that results in a bounciness because of the correction of itself. So, if it pushes it down and then corrects itself, this creates some kind of bounce. So of course, again, a real rigid body simulation is a better choice if that is really what you want. It only makes sense to accept that unnecessary calculation and also the bouncy nature of it if you have no alternative to that. But just keep that in mind, right? It is a little bit bouncy in nature because technically it's still a soft object that tries to be a rigid object. And the second thing you have to keep in mind, and this is why the toy here has a low res version of it in this case, if you try to do this with a pretty complex geometry, so something like this here, where we have all kinds of complex shapes, like our pig and the full toy and so on, don't be surprised if the result is not always perfect. And to make sure this is a fair analysis, this is actually with 10 substeps and 200 constraint iterations, so that should not be the reason. But if I run this, which took quite a while, then you can see at first it looks fine, besides the bounciness that we talked about, which can be actually a problem. But when you look closer, in some frames, the fact that it tries to correct itself, there you go, there's one example for this. problematic behavior, or here. So even with a really high substeps and everything, the whole setup tends to create problems when there's too much going on and too much collisions happening with too complex geometry. This is actually the reason why in the help, side effects even suggests that you do not take the actual simulated geometry, but extract out the transformation that comes out of it and put it again onto the base geometry so that there's no deformation, you only get the transformation. And for this there is the Vellum transform pieces node that takes care of this. So if you have your simulation here with the errors we just talked about, most prominent in this frame for example, then you can just use the Vellum transform pieces, and it's very similar to the point deform for example. So the first one is the Vellum geometry actually, not the one you want to deform. Then the second one is the constraint, and then the third one is the geometry you want to transform, and that's of course our original geometry. And if you try that, then something like this can happen, that at first it seems right, but then something super weird happens. The reason is that the node needs some kind of information what pieces of the geometry is part of what object. And this is here the piece attribute. And when you mouse over it, it tells you it wants an integer or a string attribute for this. So the easiest way of actually solving this is to just use a connectivity node before our simulation and as an input for our Vellum transform pieces, and make sure that you use the attribute that we just created, the class attribute of course, here under piece attribute as an input. And then unfortunately you will have to resim the whole thing because you changed the input. And now you can see it works because now the Vellum transform pieces knows what each point belongs to which object because of the class attribute, and can deform the original objects accordingly. Now, as you can see though, when you have very complex geometry, it's still not perfect because during the simulation there might still be some kind of deformation like here. And since the Vellum transform pieces only takes the center of an object, it sometimes can be a little bit inaccurate and feel a bit odd. But for simpler cases than that, and especially when you have interaction with soft bodies and so on, this works reasonably fine. And you can certainly get rid of those weird deformation problems like this one here. So this is why it's good to know. And let's finish this off with an example that we had in the course where shape match would have been handy to use. Pretty simple to use again. You just create a new constraint called shape match, which will make sure that the shape is not changing simply. This system has two disadvantages. One, it tends to be bouncy in nature, which is just because it's a Vellum system. And secondly, if you have really complex geometry, it tends to be unstable. So it's not a full replacement for a real rigid body system, but it can be a really good option if you have something like that where you need to combine different simulation types with Vellum in one simulation. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.